See if that works. Oh, okay, good. So hello, my name is Conor McHugh. So what I'm going to talk about is something called the problem of the Criterion. So this is an ancient problem in epistemology, in the theory of knowledge. And the problem starts from a question, or rather a pair of questions. What can we know, and how can we know those things? Okay, so you might ask those questions in a kind of specific way about a specific subject matter. So you might ask yourself, can I know what the weather is going to be like tomorrow? And if so, how can I know about that? So can I know that by assuming that the weather will be the same tomorrow as it is today, or by listening to what the weather forecast says, or by consulting my tea leaves? But you can also ask those questions in a kind of perfectly general way, so not about any particular subject matter, but just in general, what can I know? What things can I know? And in general, by means of what sources of information can I know those things? So the problem of the Criterion starts from those two questions. The ancient philosophers from whom this problem originates, they thought of this very general question about what we can know and how as a kind of question of practical importance, right? So they thought of it as the kind of question that any inquirer would ask themselves and want to answer in order to sort of guide their inquiries into how things are. And they sort of, understandably enough, thought it's the kind of question that you might expect philosophy to help us with, right? The sort of question that philosophers should try and answer. So from that point of view, this question, what can I know and how, is more or less equivalent really to the question, well, what's true and how can I tell, right? So if I want to find out what's true, I need to identify the things that I can know and the ways in which I can come to know them, and then I can kind of satisfy myself that I've identified which things are true. Okay. So in simple terms, the problem goes something like this. Look, in order to tell which particular things I know, I need to first be able to tell which of my sources of information are reliable or give me genuine knowledge, right? So I need to know where I can get accurate information from. But in order to tell that a particular source of information is accurate or gives me knowledge or is reliable, I need first to be able to tell that the particular bits of information that it gives me are indeed accurate, right? I need to be able to tell that what it's telling me really is true. So in other words, I need to first be able to identify some particular pieces of knowledge or some particular truths in order to assure myself that a given source of information really is a good source. But so now it looks like we have a kind of circle. So in order to tell which particular things I know, I need to identify some source of information that I can rely on. But in order to identify a reliable source, I need to rely on some particular claims, some particular things that I take myself to know by means of which I can tell that this source really is reliable and accurate. So in order to do either of those two things, I need to first do the other one, and so I can't do either of them, right? It's impossible. So this is sometimes called problem of the wheel, so because of this kind of circular structure, but more commonly as the problem of the Criterion. So this is in some ways a very, very, very fundamental problem in epistemology and indeed in philosophy. Nonetheless, it has a somewhat intermittent history. So, as I said, it goes back to the ancients, and in particular, people tend to trace it to the writings of Sextus Empiricus, who was one of the ancient skeptics. So, around about the 2nd or 3rd century AD, he was knocking about, and he wrote a work called Outlines of Pyrrhonism, where he set out the kind of tenets of one of the kind of main brands of ancient skepticism. So the ancient skeptics basically thought we can't know anything and we shouldn't believe anything we should sort of suspend judgment on all questions. They thought of this as a kind of route to some manner of tranquility, which it might have been. So you get it in Sextus Empiricus, and then after that it kind of shows up occasionally, but kind of not that much in a very sustained way. So Montaigne wrote about it. He wrote a quite important treatment of it. A bit later on, there's a guy called Cardinal Mercier, who was in Leuven in Belgium, and he wrote a bit about it. You can see his statue outside the philosophy department at the Catholic University in Leuven. And then in the 20th century, interest in the problem of the criterion was reignited primarily by some work by Roderick Chisholm, who is a kind of important epistemologist of the mid-20th century, and he wrote about this problem and said he thought it was, in a way, the most fundamental problem in epistemology. But it hasn't, interestingly, received the same kind of sustained attention as some other problems in epistemology, despite its kind of fundamental standing. I guess, as an aside, part of the reason for that might be because when you sort of start looking at it more carefully, there are maybe several different problems that one could tease apart, which need to be treated separately, but I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to first just go through the problem in a little bit more detail to kind of understand the structure of it, and then I'll talk a bit about some possible responses. So you can think of it this way. So you find yourself with a bunch of beliefs, right? A bunch of opinions about the world. So you think that grass is green and that the John Hansford Gallery is in Southampton, and you have a bunch of beliefs about what has happened in the past and about various other things. You believe that 2 + 2 is 4 and so on. So you have all these beliefs or opinions. And then you have a task. So you know that you're not infallible, right? So you want to sort the good beliefs or the opinions you can rely on, you can take to be accurate, or you can take to constitute knowledge, from the bad ones, or the ones that are false or inaccurate or unjustified, or something like that. So it's a kind of sorting task with respect to your beliefs. And then the idea is that, well, look, if I'm going to sort out the good beliefs from the bad ones, I better have some kind of criterion for distinguishing between them. So this is why it's called the problem of the criterion. So there better be some marker, if you like, that the good beliefs, the knowledgeable ones or the accurate ones, the ones I can rely on, there better be some marker that they bear on the basis of which I can hold on to those ones, count them as the good ones, and that the bad ones lack, right? So that's roughly what's meant by a criterion in this context. So just to give an example of that, Descartes, who of course is in some ways the founder of modern philosophy and of modern epistemology in particular, he didn't really discuss the problem of the criterion, at least not in the terms that I'm talking about it today. But he did in fact have something a bit like a criterion. So he thought that what he called clear and distinct perception was a criterion for truth, or perhaps for certainty or something like that. So he thought that if you clearly and distinctly perceived something to be the case, then you could be sure that that was indeed true, you could count on it as knowledge, and then you could form other opinions on its basis. So when he did his famous cogito argument, where he said that because he was doubting, he must therefore exist, and then he went on to make some claims about the nature of the self that exists, that it's a purely mental being. He did so on the basis of the idea that he clearly and distinctly perceived these things to be so, and so he could rely on them. So perception doesn't mean sense perception, it just means a kind of apprehension of truth or something like that. So that was Descartes' criterion. But the problem comes in when we observe that it looks as though a criterion doesn't really help us in distinguishing the good beliefs from the bad ones unless we can tell that it gives us the right results, right? Unless we can tell that it really is an accurate marker of the reliable or knowledgeable opinions. And it looks as though in order to tell that a criterion gives the right results, we would need to be able to check the results that it gives us, right? And check whether the beliefs that satisfied that criterion really were knowledgeable, accurate, true. So in other words, we need to be able to identify some particular instances of knowledge in order to identify our criterion. And now we have the circle, right? So in order to sort the good beliefs from the bad ones, we have to first identify some criterion for doing so. But in order to identify a criterion, we have to first be able to sort out good from bad beliefs. And so we can't do either of those things. So going back to Descartes' criterion, clear and distinct perception, we might ask, well, hang on, Descartes, what justifies you in relying on this criterion? Why do you take it that just because you are having this experience that you call clear and distinct perception, what justifies you in thinking that that really is a kind of accurate indicator of the truth, right? Particularly given that Descartes has done this thought experiment where he's imagining that he's being deceived by an evil demon, if you recall. So it seems as though the demon could equally give Descartes some misleading, clear and distinct perceptions. So why does Descartes think he's allowed to rely on this criterion? Well, of course, he might get some justification for that if he could point out some particular things that he believes on the basis of that criterion that he could show in some independent way to be true, right? But of course the whole point is that he doesn't have any independent way of showing that those things are true, because the existence of such a way of showing things to be true is precisely what's at issue. Now, in fact, there's an interesting question in Descartes' scholarship about whether he does fall into a kind of circle like this. So famously, a lot of people think he does. They think that there's a kind of fallacy in the argument in Descartes' Meditations, and this is called the Cartesian circle. And it's kind of an instance of the problem of the criterion, although, as I say, Descartes himself wasn't thinking in exactly those terms. Okay, so I said that in order to identify a criterion, I'd have to be able to check that it gives the right results in particular instances, that the particular deliverances it gives me are indeed accurate. And you might think, well, hang on, why does that have to be the only way that I could identify a criterion? So couldn't I instead just give some kind of argument or appeal to some sort of principle that justified me in working with a particular criterion? Well, it's true that you could do that, right? But the problem then would be that what you'd be appealing to there would be simply another criterion, a kind of higher order one, right? A criterion for criteria. So you'd be saying, well, the criterion of truth must be something that has such and such property. So this thing here is a criterion. Okay, but why does the criterion have to have such and such property? What justifies you in thinking that? And now it looks like you just face the same question again. So you either have to give us some justification for that higher order criterion, appealing to another, a yet higher one, or you need to show us that it gives the right results by showing that the particular criteria it licenses are themselves accurate. And so we just have the same problem again, but one level up. And interestingly, not that this talk is supposed to be about Descartes scholarship or anything like that, nor would I be competent to do it. One thing that kind of seems to happen in the Meditations, at least on one interpretation, is that he does go to a kind of higher order criterion. But it gets kind of confusing. So one thing that happens is that he appeals to the existence of a God, right? So he thinks he can give this a priori proof that there's a God. And then he seems to claim that he can rely on the criterion of clear and distinct perception because a perfect God would not permit him to be misled by clear and distinct perceptions, because that would be mean. So whether or not that is exactly how Descartes' argument goes, we can observe that if it did go that way, then he would face this further problem, right? So he would have gone from this criterion of clear and distinct perception to a higher order criterion. So the criterion for truth must be whatever a God would make sure accurately track the truth, if you like. So that's a criterion for criteria. And then we can just press the question again. Well, Descartes, what justifies you in thinking that that's a good higher order criterion? Okay, so that's kind of the rough shape of the problem. So in his treatment of it, Roderick Chisholm wrote about this a few times in the 20th century. He distinguishes three different kinds of response you could have to the problem of the criterion. So the first response is a kind of non-response. So the first response is just to accept that this problem is insoluble. And so it turns out that we can't tell anything about what we can know, right? Nor can we tell anything about how we would come to know anything. And so there's no guidance to be had in thinking about knowledge or thinking about how we achieve it. So he calls that view skepticism. It's not exactly the same as skepticism as that term is usually used by philosophers, but this is a kind of particular kind of skepticism. And he doesn't really give too much shrift to this view because it looks it looks disastrous, especially for epistemologists, right? It's our job to come to conclusions about what we can know and how. So if it turns out that that's impossible, then we're in a pretty bad situation. But even you might think also for ordinary people, like it's part of our human predicament, you might think, to reflect on what we can know and how we should go about that. And according to this response, there's no guidance to be had by doing that. You're not going to get anywhere. So that seems kind of depressing and also just pretty implausible in a way. Like it just seems kind of obvious that we can think about how we can come to know things, what sources of information we can rely on, and so on. We do that and we do it fruitfully, so it's surely not true that we can't. Okay, so that looks like a bad response. Second response, Chisholm calls methodism. So methodism is the view that we can somehow identify criteria for knowledge without relying on first identifying particular instances of knowledge. So this is just to deny one of the two claims that gives rise to the circle. So Chisholm attributes this approach to John Locke, the famous British empiricist. So he says that Locke claims that sense perception is the criterion for knowledge. So beliefs of ours that are based on sense perception, at least most of the time, I guess, we can take it that they're pretty much accurate. I don't know if that's an accurate interpretation of Locke. I mean, Locke obviously does think that knowledge derives from sense perception. That much is true. But I don't know if he counts as a Methodist. But anyway, that's what Chisholm says. And so the problem for this view is simply that it's just not obvious what the criterion or criteria should be, right? So it's not obvious, sort of a priori, if you like, that sense perception can be relied on to give us truth, right? so it's not obvious. So since it's not obvious, it looks like we need some kind of justification for claiming that this is a criterion for truth and knowledge. But of course, as soon as we ask for a justification for this criterion, then we're back on the wheel, right? So the justification will have to be either some particular claims about knowledge, particular things we know, or a kind of higher order criterion. So, something like, God gave us perception, and so it must be accurate, or something like that. But either way, we end up back in this kind of problem of circularity. So that's Methodism. So it's so called because, as it were, it kind of says, well, we can identify the method first and then identify the instances. The third response that Chisholm distinguishes, he calls particularism. So this response consists in denying the other of the two claims that gives rise to the circle. So according to the particularist, we can identify particular instances of knowledge or particular things that are true and known to be so without using any criteria. So the thought here is just that we can start by saying, look, it's just obvious that there are certain things we know, right? So we know that grass is green, and we know that the Hansard Gallery is in Southampton, and Cameron's the Prime Minister, and Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD, and lots of other things besides. Chisholm places this response to the problem of the criterion in the tradition of what's sometimes known as common sense philosophy. So this tends to get traced back to people like Thomas Reid, who is a great Scottish Enlightenment philosopher. And Reid basically thought that if philosophy produces arguments that lead to conclusions that are contrary to common sense, then you'd better check the argument because there's probably something wrong with it. So he thought, in some way, common sense should be our kind of, if not a fixed point, at least something that we're very unwilling to give up. So when philosophy leads to very, very counterintuitive conclusions, it will typically be the case that the argument is much less convincing on examination than is the common sense claim itself, right? And so an instance of this would be somebody might try and produce some skeptical argument to the effect that we don't know anything about the external world. The kind of Thomas Reid type response to that would be, look, the premises of that argument are much less obviously right than is the claim that we do know a bunch of stuff about the world. So we should stick with that common sense view rather than endorsing some kind of very wacky, counterintuitive philosophical view based on some sort of clever argument. G.E. Moore similarly falls in this tradition, and this is also, this particularist response is the one that Chisholm himself endorses. So Chisholm says, look, it just is obvious that there are certain things that we know, so we can take that as a starting point, and on that basis we can identify what the criteria for knowledge are. So a bunch of the things we know, we seem to know indeed on the basis of sense perception, so we might conclude on the basis of that sense perception is indeed a reliable method of acquiring information about the world. So there's a kind of very immediate, obvious way in which this is a very unsatisfying, unhelpful kind of response to the problem. So if you were genuinely doubtful about what you could know and genuinely wondering and wanting an informative answer to that, this wouldn't be a very helpful response, right? Because Chisholm would just be saying, oh, here are some examples of things you know, like grass is green and Hansard Gallery in Southampton and blah, blah, blah. And you might think, well, okay, maybe I do, but I don't feel very enlightened by you telling me that. And Chisholm kind of acknowledges this much. He says that this response begs the question in a certain sense, by which I take it he means, well, he might mean various things. For one thing, he doesn't give any argument for his claim that we know these things. For another, he just flatly denies the opposing views, or at least he flatly denies the view, for example, that says we can't know those things, or the view that says we can't identify which things we know. So in that sense, it's not a very satisfying response, but nonetheless, it might be a helpful response in a sort of more limited way. So given that, I take it, we do in fact think we know certain things, like the kinds of things I mentioned a moment ago, and we don't seriously doubt that we know those things, this particularist response might help us by giving us a kind of starting point for our epistemological theorizing, if you like. So we can say, well, look, plausibly, here are some instances of knowledge, here are some things we can know, and once we've identified them, we can start thinking about, well, how is it that we get that knowledge, and can we articulate some kind of general principles about how knowledge is acquired, and so on. And furthermore, even if it's kind of controversial in the context of this particular debate, the starting point of this particularist response is very plausible, right? It is indeed very plausible that we know those things. And, in a way, it's not clear what more you can ask of a solution to a problem than that it start from claims that are, in fact, very plausible. After all, we have to start somewhere, right? I mean, you get this sort of dialectic happening sometimes in philosophy where there's a skeptical type position where they won't concede any starting point to you. So any claim you make, they'll say, well, I don't accept that. And of course it's impossible to defeat an opponent like that on their own terms, right? But that's just because they've kind of, they're engaging in the debate in a way that makes that impossible, but that's not very interesting. So, maybe this particularist response is kind of good enough for our purposes, even if it wouldn't enable us to win over a kind of skeptical opponent. In fact, so Chisholm distinguishes those three responses. In fact, you might identify a kind of fourth response, which would involve combining, in a certain sense, methodism and particularism. So the idea here would be, rather than thinking that we have to start with a criterion and then build everything on top of that, or start with some particular claims about knowledge and then work out the criteria on the basis of that, what we can instead do is try and find a kind of coherent combination of particular claims and principles that hangs together and vindicates our intuitive judgments, if you like. So this is a sort of coherentist approach, appealing to the method that's sometimes called reflective equilibrium. So reflective equilibrium, roughly, is when we, rather than taking our particular judgments as kind of unrevisable, and rather than trying to work out sort of a priori some general principle and taking that as unrevisable, instead what we do is we take plausible particular judgments and sort of plausible general principles, and we see if we can work out a view that hangs together in a kind of satisfying, explanatorily coherent way. So nothing is immune to revision, right? It might be that we end up denying some particular claims that we thought were plausible, or some principles that we thought were kind of compelling. But nonetheless, we kind of hang on to as much as we can of what initially seemed plausible to us, and we come to a view that kind of hangs together in a plausible way. So I think it might be that this is kind of the most sort of plausible response to the problem of the criterion, in that it just seems true that we shouldn't be starting from particular knowledge claims that we regard as absolutely immune to revision and unquestionable. It seems more kind of sensible to do something more like this reflective equilibrium procedure. But of course, this response does no better than the particularist response, or indeed the Methodist one, in reassuring the person who genuinely doubts what they know or how they can know it, and reassuring that person that the opinions they started from are more or less accurate, right? Because in a sense, we're kind of taking that for granted. Similarly, this view begs the question against the skeptic because it assumes that we can identify some particular instances of knowledge, perhaps not with certainty, but with, as it were, some degree of justification, and similarly for some criteria. Okay, so that's the coherentist view. Okay, I shouldn't go on too much longer. Let me just say a little bit about kind of the contemporary perspective on this stuff. So I think as a kind of sociological claim, it would be true to say that some version of the coherentist type approach I just described, or some kind of particularism of the kind I mentioned previously, those kind of views are widely accepted, I think, nowadays. And I think one kind of reason that philosophers have gotten kind of comfortable with those kinds of views is that, well, in a certain way, they've gotten a bit less kind of optimistic about what philosophy can achieve. So I kind of mentioned at the start that you might think of this problem of the criterion as arising from a question that we, as inquirers, are kind of bound to ask ourselves and bound to grapple with in order to guide our inquiries into what's true. And it's kind of charming that philosophers thought they could help with that kind of, practical everyday problem, but I think, philosophers have taken a lot of blows to their confidence over the centuries, and I think we're now sort of mostly resigned to the idea that we're not going to be much help with those kinds of questions. So people are just a bit more sanguine, I think, about the prospect of settling on a view that says, well, look, if you really are doubtful about what you can know and how, then I'm not sure I can provide you with anything that's going to convince you. And if you're skeptical, I'm certainly not going to be able to defeat you on your own terms. But nonetheless, insofar as we're allowed to take some things for granted, we can achieve a view that is satisfying and vindicates, broadly speaking, our intuitive judgments and advances our understanding of knowledge, among other things. I think another development that's kind of helped here is that philosophers, or epistemologists, I guess, have come to kind of draw a more sharp distinction than perhaps the ancients did, and even the early moderns like Descartes, between the endeavor of theorizing about knowledge, doing epistemology, if you like, so asking these very general questions about how knowledge is acquired, and the endeavor of trying to acquire knowledge, right? The endeavor of being an ordinary human inquirer, so trying to find stuff out. So rather than thinking that these very general questions about what we can know and how are questions that any inquirer has to start with in a certain sense and kind of resolve before they can come to any justified views about anything, nowadays I guess we tend to think that it's sort of fine for people to sort of ignore those very general theoretical questions. They don't need to first solve the problem of the criterion or work everything out from some kind of Cartesian starting point in order to know anything. So in order to know that grass is green, all you need to do is, pretty much see some grass and believe that it's how it looks. You don't need to first come up with a theory of knowledge. So the thought is, look, ordinary people, and maybe even some philosophers, do have knowledge, and epistemology has a kind of job of trying to understand how that works. So, we're paid to theorize about this stuff. But the epistemologist's job isn't to kind of blunder in and start guiding people in their inquiry and sort of confusing them with sophistry. I mean, we can do that stuff, but that's not our kind of main job. And so insofar as we kind of make this more sharp distinction between epistemology as a theoretical enterprise and ordinary inquiry into ordinary questions like what colour grass is, to that extent the problem of the criterion might seem less pressing, at least from a practical perspective, even if it remains quite puzzling, philosophically speaking. So I think for those reasons, philosophers nowadays are somewhat more sanguine about the problem. So maybe I'll stop there. Thanks.